Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Daniel Ciraldo. I'm the executive director here at the Miami Design Preservation League, and we're very excited to have the third of our 4 lectures all about Morris Lapidus. Tonight is very special because we have 2 very special guests joining our wonderful curator, Deborah Desilets, and our first guest is Aaron Betsky, and he's the director of the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech, and a critic and author of more than a dozen books on art, architecture, and design. Trained at Yale, Betsky has worked as a designer for Frank Gehry and Associates and Hodgetts and Fung. He taught at SCI-Arc and served as a director of the 11th Venice International Architecture Biennale. And we also have Reid Kroloff, who is the Dean of Illinois Institute of Technology's College of Architecture. With a career spanning more than 25 years, he's also been editor-in-chief of Architecture, which under his direction became the nation's leading architectural magazine. And he was Dean of Tulane University School of Architecture, which he led through Hurricane Katrina and the following recovery. And he was also director of the famed Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum, which you'll all remember we did the virtual tour of Saarinen House during Art Deco weekend in January. So we'd all love to visit some time as well in person. And he's been a national commentator on architecture and design in places like the New York Times, Esquire, and Metropolis, and done many other great things, including with his firm, Jones Kroloff. His clients have included the High Line in New York City, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the National History Museum of Los Angeles, MIT, Yale University, and many others. So we'd like to give a round welcome to our guests, and now I'll pass it over to Deborah. Thank you.
Well, I first want to thank everyone for coming out, and I would like to thank the Miami Design Preservation League for having these concentrated lectures on the topic of Morris Lapidus. I'm trying to introduce the subject again tonight in a different way. We've already had 2 lectures. And so tonight, I just wanted to give a little bit of a cheat sheet on Morris Lapidus while I read to you words that were said in 1997 by Dean Silvetti. Morris Lapidus was born in 1902 in Odessa, Russia. His mother, a seamstress, his father, a coppersmith. They decided to leave the horrors of the Bolshevik uprisings and come to America. He was 6 months old when he came to America on Ellis Island, and the family lived in many of the different ghettos of the city. He was 6 years old when he entered elementary school, unable to speak English. From these uncompromising, hard beginnings, he went on to become first an actor, a set designer, and finally an architect at Columbia University. Sometimes he would do odd jobs as an X-ray assistant, and maybe you can put all these things together to explain where he's coming from, but as a boy, he discovered the beauty of electricity in illegal escapades to Coney Island with his Uncle Harry. He had never seen such buildings, this wonderful, whirling, twisting world of color. And suddenly the lights went on, and he said, I thought the place was on fire. They were marvelous. In this way, too, he saw for the first time flowers in a field behind the tracks. He saw the colors and wanted to go and pick them, all of those flowers, for his mother. Now, I'm going to let you read the book. Too much is never enough to figure out how he got out of the coma that he was put in. For 22 years, he did store designs, and we all know those store designs led to a theory that became some of his, used in some of his more famous hotels that he did on Miami Beach. But during that time, his language of forms came to be known as cheese holes, woggles, bean poles. And after he built the string of hotels in Miami, the Caribbean, and the United States, Europe, Asia, more than 200, that was overall, and yet he was really never published in American magazines, even after he had practiced for over 40 years. So why was that the establishment did not like Mr. Lapidus? Who was afraid of Mr. Lapidus? Why was the architect that affected so many lives and received such wide public and foreign acceptance, why has it taken so long to at least be acknowledged by the profession and academia? And Dean Silvetti said at that time that this should be a matter of reflection. In 1997, he said that. Among the proposing of a very persuasive late 20th century issue, that of the relationship of architecture, pop culture, and taste. Tonight we're going to talk about style in architecture, the issue of pressing style. Morris said, I didn't have a style, I just wanted to do something to people. So he was looking at human nature. It's good for us to be concerned, and it has political and bigger implications if we look at what Lapidus was saying, that the people were his clients, and that looking at pop culture and looking at the avant-garde and trying to give people what they want might be patronizing, but in a way Lapidus was trying to understand his client's client and build for people. So around the mid-60s, with the arrival of pop art and then with architectural theory, Dean Silvetti reminded us that the landscape of the course of architecture began to change, and the political processes that are involved in part of this in architectural schools began to change. But his architecture is an architecture of concrete human needs. This Silvetti wanted to say for sure, which were not only functional but also symbolic, and which emerged not from theory but from observation and from elaboration of those needs that he experienced. He was original, and he had unexpected talent, which because of these proposals and ingenuity still appeal to people. I think that's why we're still talking about him. So simply put, Morris Lapidus's career, which spanned from 1927 to 1983, decades in the service to people and to housing people in his buildings, is still a question. What was his style? And who was afraid of Morris Lapidus? And what is the legacy? So this is the chronology that I hope you've enjoyed reading. He was wanting to be an actor and then a set designer and then wound up doing architecture. His project spanned you see how many years it spanned, 30 years, and he had a total of 1,034 projects. The 450 stores, none of them exist anymore except in books. And the period that he was designing in, the context for that would have been the 1946 to 1964, and it spans this 50s decade, which is often called the post-war era. And pop culture had changed, and it helped to define that era. Rock and roll music began to dominate. Hospitals could have TVs. And the changes in that pop culture began to define the 1950s. Music went from jazz to rock, and people turned on their radios, and they turned on. These are the buildings that Lapidus thought responded to that pop culture of the time. You've seen more of the pictures in the exhibit, so I'm just briefly trying to explain or show examples of his style that we'll talk about later. This is the Delito Hotel. We still have that here. This is the interior of the Fontainebleau and the famous Stair to Nowhere. This is the Eden Rock and the interior stair of the Eden Rock, which some people, because he's used wireframes balustrades, and this was a very interesting thing that he did inside of it, maybe a postmodernist twist. But this is Lapidus's Americana, which we no longer have. This is the interior of the Americana, where he had the terrarium with crocodiles in it and with birds inside of it, and people loved it. It was a fantastic terrarium. And then what we know from reading his books and from all the conversations with him, the stores that he did really were the seed for his architectural theories. And at the end, he said, I really only have 7 basic things I study: light, color, ornament, graphics. He thought floating structures are structures that look like they were floating, curves, and stairs. He did say at the end that architecture is more than brick, stone, and mortar. It's about the human spirit, and that architecture should give a lift. I consider him to be glamorous still. I'm going to quickly go through what I hope we cover as topics. The context from the 46 to 64, where pop culture changed things. And at this time, I'd like to pull up my 2 panelists and let them come and comment on context and the period. Thank you.
come undone. Hard to take a mask off and keep a mic on.
This is Aaron Betsky on my end, and this is Reid Kroloff.
Welcome. All
So,
right, you.
in terms of the context of the 50s and Lapidus doing what we can call leisure hotels, how do you think he fits into that era?
Do you want to start?
Go ahead.
I mean, you know, and you know the joy factor that he came up with an architecture of joy during like the happiest period of our time in America. Can you?
Well,
was that some synchronism?
I think it was more than pure joy. It was what I think of as limbo architecture, this architecture that takes place on the edge of both what's considered popular culture, because it was seen as more highfalutin than popular culture, and at the edge of what was considered correct modern style, but also, of course, quite simply at the edge of the continent, to a place where people went to almost not be in America before they could go to Hawaii. And that sense that you were right at the edge and testing the limits is almost physically present in the work, in the way that if there is anything that defines Lapidus's work, it's the ability to create rather massive buildings at times that he thins out where you touch them, where you see them, where they become stage sets. And we can talk about the idea of stage sets a little bit more too. That all of that together created the equivalent in architecture of the big fins in the cars, of the kind of fashion that people were wearing, of the music that was beginning to rock out and was beginning to, when you think about how people were dancing when he started to make his larger hotels, they were moving away from gravity and moving away from a set of prescribed paces towards an ability to lift yourself off in exuberance. So all of this, of course, was made possible by the incredible economic engine that America created itself after the Depression and then the Second World War, which turned out to be a big boon for the American economy. And of course, was also a way to not only celebrate that new era, but also forget about the pain and suffering of the eras before that. And Lapidus was really the house architect for that house party.
I think that's well said. And not only that, but he had been dressing us up for 40 years, David Hickey says, with all of the stores. The ready-mades were available, and then he had to make the place for us to perform. What do you say?
I would add, I think Aaron's hit on, sorry? Oh, I think Aaron's hit on a lot of good points. I'd add a few to them, which is that in the post-war period, America has had its first real taste of foreign countries. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. servicemen and women overseas for the first time, because prior to World War II, Americans very rarely traveled out of the country, and really only the very wealthiest traveled at that time. Now you have the middle class traveling in massive numbers. And this is a time when the U.S. population is less than half the size that it is now. So this is a very large number of people, and they're coming back having seen things they've never seen before. And Lapidus, and as part of that, they're looking for a style that is American, because the world's eyes for the first really sustained period of time are on America for positions of leadership. On everything, and whether it's fighting a war or running industry, the U.S. had established itself by the time the war is over. The area where it hadn't established itself was as a leading center of design outside of the automobile industry. And now you have this, it hasn't, it didn't, not in architecture.
Not true. Well, in industrial design, it was already the leader.
But anyway, they're searching for a style that's American. And Lapidus melds two things. The American look toward Europe, toward modernism, which he brings in the kind of form of his buildings, and then the American rush to a way to express itself on the inside of buildings. And that was often an awkward and halting process, and Lapidus is unafraid to try all kinds of different things. So you can have a little bit of France and a little bit of Italy and a little bit of Asia and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and his buildings kind of become a world tour for people who don't have necessarily the money to travel overseas or the time to do that, because airplane travel is just coming in toward the middle of his career, and so Americans are still pretty domestic. So I think he puts those two things together in a way that touches a pop cultural chord and drives leading architects crazy at the same time.
But it is interesting that it is a styling of modernism.
It is a styling. It is absolutely that.
Rather than inventing a whole new way of making buildings, or even a whole new way of theorizing architecture, it is instead a way to give it a curve, to lighten it, to light it in a particular way. All those basic points that he talks about that allow this kind of American architecture to have its particular take on the stripping down, the streamlining, the simplifying, the abstraction, the clarity that had actually started in Europe and moved to America from there. And so it is very self-consciously a style, an American resort style.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say something that most people might not know, is that Lapidus never went to Europe when he
Right.
designed the Fontainebleau. So he went to Europe as a paid vacation and a paid buying vacation for the Eden Rock. And so everything that he bought for the Fontainebleau was found on 2nd Avenue. And it was all the rejects and all the secondhands and all the things that nobody wanted. Miss Normandy was sitting in a brass heap about to be smelted down when he saw her and said, she needs to come and be at my pool. It was worth $2 million at the end of her life, a few years ago. He bought it for $800. So, that Lapidus in the Fontainebleau was all exuberance. And then you see him in the Eden Rock, and he gets a little bit more, refined, I think. More reserved, because now he's been there. And he comes back a little more quelled by the awesomeness of the reality. But I do think that the Fontainebleau has that particular swank and exuberance, all that American stuff, untouched by anything except what he had absorbed from books and his own dreams.
But I think that even before that, when you look at the work he did in retail, which is as good, if not better, than the hotels in many ways, it was all about displaying the wealth and goods and the style of all of the objects that Americans could buy and should buy to get themselves out of the Depression. So that, it reminds me very much of the way in which the term streamlining was invented. When they asked, was it Norman Belgetti's? No, it was Loewy.
Loewy.
They asked Raymond Loewy, why are you streamlining? He said, I want America to streamline its way out of the Depression. And that sense that you're going to sweep away all objections, all hindrance, but also all class distinctions, all preconceptions. You can be a immigrant Jew from a very poor family in New York and make it big in this newfound town of Miami Beach.
and we're going to talk about that right now. Most people don't think about the Borscht Belt or about the Catskills connecting to Miami Beach, but indeed, Lapidus from 1948 until 1959 was going between Grossinger's, the Concorde, the New Rochelle, and
Kushner's.
the Kushner's. And it's a phenomenon when you read what he was doing, putting in the lanai, putting in the indoor pool, putting in the golf course, doing the master planning. So he was learning from himself on Miami Beach, bringing it back to the Catskills, and there was a bounce between these places. And finally, the Borscht Belt, named after the beet soup, finally settled, I guess, on Miami Beach. Can you talk about that a little?
As part of his architecture?
As part of his, his experience, what he was leaving in New York, what he was bringing to Florida, the relationship of the Catskills and Miami Beach.
Well, of course, they're both Jewish audiences, big, heavily Jewish audiences, and that goes to what Aaron is beginning to talk about a minute ago. The outsider, the person who hasn't been part of the accepted circle. Getting to make their place. And America has a long history of that. And for the Jews, it's sort of the middle of the 20th century where they have a greater amount of attention being paid to them before, greater attention than paid to them before. And we see it, I think it reaches its apogee actually a little later. It reaches its apogee with people like, I think, the height absolute is Ralph Lauren, a made-up name from a guy named Lipschitz, who is used to looking in the windows at all of the country clubs set that he was never, and his family never allowed to actually visit. And so he's just going to make his own version, his own world, and sell it to the same people who weren't going to let them in before. That's the great trick, is to invert it. And Morris, I don't think consciously does that. Ralph Lauren consciously did that. I think Morris Lapidus watches a lot of film in the earlier part of his life. He's a drama person, and he sees the representation that all the Hollywood Jews are making of the life that they want everyone to see and live. And Lapidus starts to translate that into an architectural world with these, especially at the resorts. And so the connection between leisure, whether it's leisure for Jewish audiences exclusively or leisure for a place in Miami Beach where you're mixing people from different cultures, is where I think he feels super comfortable.
Yeah, and I think that the best guide to all of this, and by the way, I looking that I realized that my father was 4 years younger than Morris Lapidus. He didn't get to design anything up in the Borscht Belt. He worked there as a waiter to put himself through City College, and then through graduate school at Harvard. But the guide to all of this, I think, is the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. It really gets all of that very right, because for any of you that have seen it, the characters are a nouveau riche a Jewish family that is trying very hard to out-wasp the wasp. Mm-hmm. But in so doing, they give everything this particular flair and style that is on the verge of somewhere between beautiful and bizarre. And they also then have this way of retreating to the Borscht Belt, to up to the Catskills, and finding their Jewishness there, while at the same time having this attempt to be very proper and filled with all these rules. And of course, there's the great episode where they come down to the Fontainebleau and she walks down that staircase.
You're giving away my ending, but okay.
but that sense
but
that,
okay.
But it's not just Jews. I think that Lapidus is an example of what America culture has done over and over again. And by the way, Ralph Lauren wasn't the first. Paul Stewart was.
Not the first. I just mean
right,
the biggest,
right,
the highest.
But
But
anyhow, because the Italians did the same thing and the Irish did the same thing. I mean, Irish, John Kennedy. I mean, it's the same idea. So the sense that in order to make it in what is considered to be polite America, you have to go one step beyond you have to do everything that's expected and then go one step beyond, I think is part of the style, part of what we're talking about with Morris Lapidus.
Is this the too much is never enough?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, we have, David Hickey is saying that the Mapplethorpe pictures were too much because they pushed you to be in the pictures, in the act of it.
Yeah, and
so is the too much the fact that Lapidus pushes us into the architecture to be the actors? He breaks the fourth wall.
Yeah.
Too much is Lapidus's rejection of the canon of modernism that controls architecture circles, many of the leading architectural circles in the U.S. and around Europe for about 30, 40 years. And it's actually codified. There are international congresses of architects that say, you can do this, but you can't do that. You can do that, but you can't do this. And at some point, a group of architects say, you can take a hike. I'm going to do what I want. And Lapidus was one of those. And where he had his greatest success is also his great emotional failure, downfall. He is able to limn that space between high and low culture, the high culture of European modernist architecture and the low culture of American import international tackiness, and put them together in a way that we today see as convincing, but the architectural profession in its day saw as an apostasy, just an absolute horrifying monster show of Frankenstein kind of architecture, and it rejected him. I'll just finish 1 second.
Yeah.
It rejected him, and that hurt him terribly. He was ostracized by his own profession for traipsing over that line, and the modernists simply did not allow it, and they pushed the bird out of the nest. Sorry.
No, it's just, and what's interesting is part of it has to do with American insecurity, because at exactly the same time that he was doing this in the United States, the Italian architect Gio Ponti was doing exactly the same thing in Italy, making these buildings filled with bizarre references, designing cruise ships that were as exuberant and as curved and as light, and have actually a lot of the same effects that Morris Lapidus's public spaces in the hotels here do, and was running the architectural establishment in Italy with magazines and everything else. So I think there are two things going on. Yes, there was a rejection, but the rejection had to do more with American insecurity proving that they actually knew what the standards were. And the second was that Lapidus himself refused. He very easily could have taken his position and translated that, and there were some architects in California who did the same thing, into positions of power, teaching, sponsoring various kind of events that then created a coterie for them. And this is one thing Lapidus never did.
There's something we have to remember too. At the same time that Lapidus is going down this path, there's a string of American architects and designers that are going down a very different path, and they are both inside and outside the canon of modernism, and they're pushing boundaries in their own ways, but in ways that don't refer to pop culture in the way that Lapidus did. And I'll just use one example, that's Eero Saarinen. And Saarinen is not afraid to be swoopy, and he's not afraid to make a chair the shape of your butt, right? And say, well, it's the shape of the human anatomy, as opposed to it looks like an ass, right? But it's not encrusted with jewelry. It's completely reduced to a simple formal move. These Americans, whether it's Saarinen or Florence Knoll or Harry Bertoia or any of them,
or Bruce Goff.
Bruce
Goff is another
really
one
good.
more on the side on the Lapidus, but they become the dominant conversation, and Morris Lapidus stands outside of it, and in a way rejects it. in his own drive to popularize and to absorb popular taste.
Yes.
And that's a dangerous place for an architect to be, because architects like to think of themselves as intellectuals, and that's not populism, is not an intellectual position
Right.
in the current world, and it certainly wasn't then. And so it put him in a dangerous position, and the more they pushed him away, the more further he ran.
It's true. And I think he backed away from the establishment of the AIA because of that. The rejection did bother him. He did always say that he could care less. And so I think the hurt
But he couldn't have cared more.
But he really couldn't have
Yeah,
cared. It's
yeah.
true. He couldn't have cared more. But in the end, he took what I think was his generational view. And he said, for people of my generation, we didn't know anything about America. So it was all theater anyway.
Yeah.
So can you comment on this idea that he's such an outsider and he's wondering, okay, I'm just going to study what people really are. And I'm going to let that generate my design ideas. What do you say to that?
There's a generation of people who did that. Social scientists and architects. I think of Holly White, a man who spent, I don't even know, thousands of hours just looking at how people walk through a park, right, or sit on a chair, or occupy a public space, which a park is, observing human behaviors. And then there's architects who do the same thing. And Lapidus is one who takes it upon himself. He actually sits and observes and watches people to see how they react to things. He comes up with part of the reason he's not more successful, I think, in his own game is some of his language. So he comes up with something he calls the moth theory about attracting people to buildings by lighting them, rather than talking about lighting as a psychological, something where you can wrap good language on. He uses popular language to describe these things, and it devalues it in terms of the intellectual side. And so he's one of these guys who wants, he says he doesn't, but he wants the recognition of the intelligentsia, right? But he can't bring himself to play in their field. And
his syntax was not there.
But
he spoke Russian until he was 6.
He's very well spoken. We both
right,
spent time with him. The guy was
he was so well spoken.
Well spoken. And so smart.
And he was so incredibly smart. And
Oh my
so
goodness.
he assimilated as much as he possibly could.
And well read.
And so well read, yes.
Yeah. I mean, he knew what he was doing. He jumped into it. But I think we should talk for a minute about the theatricality, because I know Aaron can talk about this and has written widely about this. It's very easy to see that his buildings are driven by theater. His obsession with lighting, his notion of planes as things you puncture,
Yes.
rather than solids. They are simply sets and screens, and his use of set decoration at a large scale, which we would call a lobby or something like that, where he's bringing objects to the stage through which people circulate.
Creating props.
Making props and asking us to use them.
Yeah,
right? Asking us to designing staircases so women have to be where their left hand is on the banister to show their wedding ring as they come down. He literally said that, right? So this is a guy who's stage directing that he can. Architects like to think that their architecture can force people to do things. For the most part, other than staircases and elevators and hallways, that's just not true. People move wherever they want. But Lapidus tried very hard to attract certain kinds of behavior and was quite successful at it. And so and he draws it from theater again and again, and spectacle. He's fascinated with spectacle everywhere he goes, and it's a wonderful, rich subject, and he invests himself in it very well. But Aaron, I know, will want to add to that.
Well, it is interesting. Part of the problem, to just address Lapidus himself, is that he started as an actor, and then he found himself to be a successful architect. How does a successful architect act?
Yes.
And in the United States and the rest of the world also, but in the United States in particular, it's been a big problem, because the successful architect has to find a way to be someone who is both glamorous and intellectual, both subservient to their client and the master builder or mistress builder type. Someone who is both aloof and below. And there's a whole history that people have researched about how architects got themselves into this particular situation. But it was for Lapidus even more acute because of the kind of clients he had and the kind of situation, both the literal clients, the developers for whom he was building, and the clientele that was coming here, and because of the way that he had made his life. So I think part of the issue is that he chose as the idea of the architect not Howard Rourke,
Right.
but also not Philip Johnson,
Yeah.
the New York highfalutin
Yeah.
type, not Eero Saarinen, the European I have theories about everything type. He was trying to maneuver a very particular kind of somewhere between a shoe salesman and a grand architect, a grand actor. And that made it particularly difficult for him because there were no models for this.
Well, just to further that, one critic called him the apogee of an architect.
Yeah, but what is the apogee?
I don't know.
It's very
this always
interesting.
was a question to
Just to
him.
give
What
you-
am I really supposed to be?
To give you a little sidestep to this, about 10 years ago, I think it was the AAA that actually sponsored this. They looked at the research of how an architect is perceived. And people perceive architects as being, especially male architects, being the most elegant, most well-dressed types. I don't think you're licensed, though, are you?
No, I'm not.
But they also consider them to be the greatest assholes.
Ooh.
I mean,
I have a question. Is that all right?
Yes, go ahead.
Because I don't want to get too far away from this particular conversation.
We can come back.
yeah.
Neither Aaron nor
Because
I.
I do have my
We-
theory about theatricality. to
There
talk
is
about.
there are a few more that we could lead into, and then we'll be open to questions. Is that okay?
I'm going to forget the question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
ask
ahead.
the question. We can come back.
You said that he was rejected by the mainstream, and he was hurt by that. So my question is, what propelled him on to do what he did? Who were his sponsors, his clients, who were not willing to listen to what the mainstream critique of him was? And when did he come to the point where the mainstream actually recognized his genius?
Those are easy questions to answer. So his clients are not architects.
I want to ask hard questions.
Yeah, no. His clients are not architects, so his clients don't give a crap what architecture
And they're
circles
self-made men.
say. They're self-made men, many of them Jewish men, right, who saw that same struggle in their own existence. And then third, there's a specific moment where he's reaccepted, and it's with the publication of his book, Too Much Is Never Enough. Deborah is a big part of that. She helped birth that book with him. And then the architectural media, myself among them, glommed to him. And he had a wonderful last 6-7 years of his life of media adulation, and the schools as well.
Yeah.
The intelligentsia had gone through some changes, and they decided, wait, this guy is a great, wonderful source of many things that we should know about. But the year is what year did the book come out?
96.
1996.
I was gonna say
His
97,
94th birthday.
Yeah. So to come back to the notion of theatricality, to get kind of serious for a second.
Yeah.
I do think that it's very important, and there's more work to be done about that. Maybe someday I'll do it myself. The British philosopher and sociologist Anthony Giddens, to bastardize what he says, believes that what motivates our lives and our social interactions is trying to find a way that we can play the role that we believe is properly ours, to act out who we think we really are, and to find fellow actors who are acting in such a way that we can fulfill our role and develop a dialogue with them in a setting, a stage set, that allows us to act out those social relations. At least this is my interpretation. When I gave a talk about what this meant for architecture with Anthony Giddens in the audience, he told me I was full of crap. So, but that, for me, is a very fundamental way to think about architecture as creating the ability for us to act out the roles that we want to play. In most cases, architects do that without realizing it, and also, to go back to our earlier conversation, without admitting to it, because you don't want to admit that it's all theater. The notion that we're acting roles goes against a very deep-seated notion we have that we are real, and we're not acting, this is who we really are, but of course, to be social, you have to act out who you are. So it becomes something that architects do almost by stealth and by using other language. The great thing about Morris Lapidus's work was that he found himself in a situation where that was the task, where in fact people came to the buildings, at least to the hotels that he designed, exactly to act out in a very conscious, very highlighted manner the roles to which they aspired in many cases, not yet who they already were. And so it gave him a chance to create these kind of stage sets. And the comparison is to architects who, in this, the same era, a little bit later, that he was doing this in a unapologetic manner, we're doing this in a theoretical manner. In the United States, the architect Charles Moore comes to mind, who, starting in the early 1960s, started thinking of his buildings also very much as stage sets, and developed theoretical positions around them. And I think someday a great comparison between Charles Moore's work and Morris Lapidus' work would be
That sounds like that would be fun.
Not unreasonable.
You make me remember that in 1963, when the American AIA had their meeting at the Americana. So Mr. Lapidus is sitting at the table, and he's had Oscar Niemeyer come.
Ah, great.
So he's sitting at the table with Oscar Niemeyer, and the men are saying how much they hate the hotel. And each one of them are having their turn at how much we hate the hotel. The phone rings, the toilet flushes in the next room, you hear it. You think the phone is ringing and it's not in your room, it's the other room. You think that the walls are shaking and it's not an earthquake, it's the people next door. He's all over it. And this was one after one of the architects saying how incredibly terrible this convention was at this hotel. And so that they all spoke, and Mr. Lapidus stood up after, and he said, "Gentlemen, I am the architect of this hotel. And I want to ask you, are you enjoying yourself?" "Oh, yes." "Oh, yes." And he said, "Then I have done my job. You will not be here permanently. And this is not meant to be your everyday life. But enjoy while you can what you can."
Yeah.
But actually, what you just said there is so important. This will not be your everyday life. And this is a little bit about what Aaron is talking about. So much of this architecture, all of Miami Beach in certain regards, is building a fantasy, something that's different than where you were. It comes to its kind of grossest, but also most endlessly fascinating, like a horrible car accident in the US in Las Vegas, which just gives away any pretense that architecture matters at all. It's just the stage set. Here, and where Lapidus is a genius, though not an intellectual, he's a genius, is making great architecture that contains the sets, but at the same time. He gets to do both in a way that is effective rather than just louche, which it is in Miami. I'm sorry, in
Vegas.
Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And it's enjoyable in Las Vegas, though. Anybody who says it isn't telling the truth or giving themselves an opportunity to let go just a little bit. Las Vegas is that boa, that feather boa against you that we all want once or twice. We may not want it all the time, right? But you can't deny that that thing feels good and your skin prickles up just a little bit. He's way more serious than that. But it's always that drive for a moment, a second, not permanent, transitory. It's a calculation of time as well as experience with him. And if you've got that 60 seconds where people go, wow, he feels like he did it. He was successful.
But you also, you started off this question about talking about the context, and a lot of it, I think, also had to do with the fact that Americans, by the time they got to his buildings, were ready for it.
Yep.
And they
Yes.
were ready for it because of the cars they drove, the
Clothing they
shows
wore.
they saw on television, the dresses they wore, very much the dresses they wore, and the kind of environments that they had grown up to aspire to. I'm reminded, I'm teaching a class with 177 freshmen right now, or frosh, and I actually did my sort of Oprah moment with them of like actually trying to get 177 people to talk. And I was trying to tease out what they expected from architecture. And it was very interesting what they, of course I should have known this, but they all have grown up on Hogwarts and Game of Thrones and everything like that. And so what they want is a neo-Gothic fantasy.
Wow.
That's their idea. You know, some architect is going to make them very happy by building that kind of environment for them. And I think that Lapidus was taking a group of people who, for the 10 or so years after the Second World War, had gone to Europe, some of them absolutely, but had also found that same kind of elegance and theatricality in the objects and images of the everyday lives. And he said, how do I make that into architecture? And succeeded.
I would add one more thing that we haven't talked about yet, but I know it will be something that Aaron probably agrees with, but certainly would have something to say with, which we've already talked about the fact that Lapidus's buildings are deeply sensual. They curve, right? They're not all a straight line. And the modernists are this kind of high Protestant ascetic.
Some of them.
High Protestant ascetic kind of restriction and reduction of everything to a kind of almost church-like formality. And then along comes...
Are you a postmodernist or something?
No, I'm a modernist. I run the Mies School, don't forget. I believe in it and I live in it, and I live it every day and with great happiness. But Lapidus is different. Lapidus to me represents, and I hate to say it like this because I always am suspicious of these things in architectural language, he represents the sexual awakening of Americans. He's right on the edge of the sexual revolution, right? It comes right in the middle of the height of his career, right? And the architecture is so sensual and it's full of things to touch and look at that you weren't supposed to do before. It's the naughty architecture gotten big, right? It's naughtiness gone wild. And the ads, if you look at the advertisements for these hotels from their time period, they're pushing that as hard as they can and still being in a family newspaper, right? They're right on the edge of this. And the cars are the same way, as Aaron has already pointed out. And people are writing about it. Jackie Suzanne is on the horizon, right? I mean, she's writing her first novel in 1964, I think. This is all at the same time. And if we don't pay attention to that and recognize it, I think we're missing something. And I don't know about Morris himself. I wouldn't even want to think about what his personal life was like in that way, because I don't want to intrude in someone's life that way. But if he didn't talk about it, he expressed it through his buildings. And that, I think, scared the pants off a lot of uptight East Coast architectural intellectuals who would, their idea of a good time with their own body is sitting in the snow.
Right.
And just
it was said of Lapidus's architecture that it was pornography of architecture.
It is.
And so that the critics couldn't have been more scathing.
But I think that's good.
But they kind of agree with that, right? So this was, and Lapidus would quote that
do you
many
know
times.
how much pornography Americans buy every year? How many billions and
He
billions
goes,
of
and
dollars?
people were buying it. I mean, that's what he said, and it was just a vacation. So the next, I guess we've wrapped that up for a minute, but we'll revisit it always. I
How
mean,
could you wrap sex up?
you can't wrap it up. But we'll get into the curve.
I mean, there it is.
There it
right?
is. I mean, that's what I wanted to give you back, is that here's Lapidus at his best. Yeah, look at that.
What is that?
Right, a big question mark in the sand. A
And
big
then what
question
is-
mark in the
and
sand.
what is, right next door, our version of a French chateau, but it's made with octopuses, right? Because we're right here in the shoreline of Miami. So I mean, it's so brilliant, all of it. The mishmash, the crazy. It's like a wacky restaurant that serves every kind of style of food on one plate. We have a little French and a little bit of German and
Surf
a
and
little bit of this. Say again?
Surf and turf.
Yes, surf
Surf
and
and-
turf. Yeah.
And he's never been to Paris. This was out of his imagination, completely a fantasy, complete fantasy. He still had not even gone to Europe. This was exactly a dream.
Yep.
Okay.
But, yeah,
But he was
look
educated in
how,
the Beaux-Arts
how those
schools.
cabanas create a kind of theater, amphitheater,
They do.
where you can sit in your shade and watch the bodies that are willing to disport themselves on the beach while pretending to watch the ocean beyond.
And when does
Right,
Ru-
of
when
course.
does-
Yes, with the foil being the beach,
when does
obviously.
when does Rudy Gernreich invent
the
the two the bikini?
bikini.
Oh, that was in 19, I know the year.
It's like
same
60s,
time.
early
60s. It was in the
early
60s, yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Architecture disappears in Lapidus's world. It appears to float. David Hickey noted that Lapidus enjoyed the idea of columns disappearing into lighted cheese holes.
Cheese holes,
He
my
says, if
point.
you run a column into a lighted hole, the weight disappears. The whole place seems lighter. It's just theater. Lapidus went back to that many times. What do you think of the way that the cheese holes absorb the structure and make it appear to float?
Well, you want to know whether he had somehow in a magazine seen the work of the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto.
yeah.
He met Alvar Aalto. He
okay,
took
well-
a tour. I mean, he took a tour and met him. A little
okay.
pilgrimage to meet
Aalto
him.
did this at the same time. They're
Yeah.
doing it at the same time,
But in pure white.
but in pure white and without any quatrefoil.
Gold. There was
Right.
no gold, right? And
Right.
no crystal.
And
Yeah.
no, look at the shape of that column. An alto column.
A
would-
fluted
so-
column,
yeah, fluted
right.
column would just have been a simple.
Yeah.
Well, you bring up a good point, because in terms of theater, Lapidus was all about textures and
Yeah.
painting and
Yeah.
style.
And
so
that's why
if
the very strange thing is that the architecture disappears implies that all architecture is structure. Because in fact, the architecture hits you in the eye and the nose and every other part of your body, to continue our earlier discussion. It is an incredible, sensuous, seductive architecture that's wrapping itself around you with every kind of boa and silk negligee that you can possibly imagine. It's just the part that's actually keeping it together that disappears. It's the bones of the buildings that go away. It's the flesh that comes to the forefront.
yes,
And
Yeah,
that's
that's true.
really what's going on there.
And it's a shame, and not a shame, sorry. It's what's the conundrum of Lapidus is that we're having this conversation about, and it doesn't make him bad or good. It's the conundrum, is that when you look at this interior, it's a beautiful interior. It's not my taste. I would never do this. But there is no way to look at this and not see it as very worked out, very thoroughly examined. Though, the columns have reference to Greek or Greco-Roman architecture. There's a beautiful contemporary sofa in the foreground that's got a kind of French flocked wallpaper pattern on the. I mean, he's thinking through all of these things, wafting across time and tying them together in an interesting way. What we're not talking about, and Aaron just said, and you said, is the architecture behind it, right? And the architecture is beautiful. He is a master manipulator of architectural form, of simple, reduced, elegant architectural. His buildings are always incredibly elegant, and they always have a relatively simple idea, whether it's clocking a room at 30, 60, 90 from the axis, or whether it's that swerve at the top. He takes everything off the outside of the building and makes you pay attention to the architecture. And then on the inside, it's like the oyster has opened up and there's the pearl, right? And with all that stuff on the inside. That's the difficulty of him, is reconciling these two things. He had no problem. The architectural profession did at that time, now would not. Or would less now, it's the frisson between the two. That is the trickiness that his career describes.
But it's a very particular moment, because he, of course, was trained as a good neoclassical architect.
Yeah.
Where doing that was, in fact, perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So the way he was educated, it was absolutely no shame to hide your structure or to reveal it when it was appropriate, and to forefront how the spaces were unfolding around you. And there were fancy French terms for that, like the marche and the partie, and there were ways of doing it. And that's how he was taught. That's how he did his first work. It was only this period, actually in the United States, between 1935 at the earliest and 1965, which just happened to be when he was at its height, that this European list of do's and don'ts hit all the American schools and academies and critics, and became the dominant way of doing that. And what's interesting, it didn't last very long. By the early 1970s,
it's over.
You had Charles Moore saying, back to Charles Moore, less is a bore.
Right.
No, that was Venturi.
Venturi said that, right.
Robert Venturi saying, less is a bore, and more is more. And that, so he just had the unlucky, but also very lucky life, given everything he, let's not feel too sorry for him.
He had a big career.
He was first.
He just happened to hit the field of architecture at a very particular point, which was one of the few points in its life. There have been a few others where there was this distinction that was dominant between how architecture was meant to be made and organized and thought about, and how it appeared, how it acted, how it was received.
Arlene Pabon, one of our first speakers, who's an architectural historian, she said he out-palaced the palaces. He had finally, American people who could not afford to have the resort, lakeside resort or the oceanside resort, all of a sudden there's this big building for them. And the freedom and the leveling of the playing field. Now, regular Mr. and Mrs. Jane America could have that experience in a building. What do you think? Was he out palacing the palaces, giving to them what they wanted and more, or? was he even using a palace as a model?
I don't think
he was a palace. I don't think
Yeah.
she's right at all.
I'm just curious about that. She said
yeah.
that, and I was curious to what your comments on that.
No, I think Morris Lapidus was, well, first of all, he's a very talented architect. So no matter what we're saying, whoops, he's a talented architect. And secondly, he's very much a stylist. If you look at his work in the 30s, it's very streamlined, it has Deco influence. If you look at his work in the 40s, it's getting even smoother and cleaner and more towards modernism.
Yes.
If you look at his work in the 50s, he is absorbing modern architecture and starting to shape his buildings, the buildings, not the interiors, as a response to that. And I think by the time the late 50s and early 60s come along, he's starting to struggle with this notion of how do you resolve this modernist, this cool, reduced modernism, which looks a little bit like the Art Deco here in Miami Beach, where he's doing a lot of his work, but still give it a more popular finish, because that would never have occurred in a 1936 Morris Lapidus shoe store.
Yeah,
that just wouldn't have been there. And so as he goes further, he as a stylist, not just an architect, but someone who's interested in style. Style changes. That's why it's the word style, right? I mean, style is a word that has a time signature in it, not just a definition. And he likes that. He embraces it. He's okay with that. There's no problem with being a stylist for him. A lot of architects talk about doing work that is timeless or timely. Morris is a timely, right? He wants his buildings to appeal to us right now and in the moment, and they did. We're doing a lot of projection onto him that I think probably is more than he actually thought about a lot of the time.
I think so.
And instead was much more interested in that timeliness and embracing it and struggling with it. And some of them come off really great, and some of them are not that great, and some of them are clumsy, and some of them are seamless. And I think that what is his greatest strength at the end of the day is he never was afraid of anything. He was just, and there are a lot of architects who are deeply fearful, whether it's rules from CIAM, which was the International Architectural Organization, afraid of those rules or afraid of the idiots at the AIA and what their rules are at any given time. Morris Lapidus just kind of went, you know, I like this. I'm going to try this. I think people like this. I've watched them. I've paid attention to them. This is what they look at. This is what they enjoy. I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it better than most people do it because I'm a supremely gifted designer, which he was.
Well, some might say he had ornamentia, but
That's cute.
Yeah.
in the next idea of going back to his stores, David Hickey was most blown away by Lapidus's use of glass as a medium, and a lot of people don't consider that light and glass are the same to him almost. Can you speak to his use of light in his architecture?
Let Aaron answer this, but I just want to point out here's 4 different stores.
Yes.
Do you see any French? Do you see any Italianate?
Yeah.
No.
No.
These are all pre-war stores. Yes, these are all pre-war stores. So,
And this was his office calling card, by the way. So this is who he really thought he was. When you're asking who is Morris Lapidus, that's his office in the quadrant at the right on the bottom.
And it really is, to be slightly provocative, I think it's a worse shame that none of these stores survive than that they glummed up the Fontainebleau.
Right.
Because, you know, the Fontainebleau you could actually kind of recreate. You know, the next owner, since they renovate these hotels regularly, someone could actually come back and, given all the photographs that exist, do a pretty faithful job at bringing it back. Hint, hint. If there happens to be here someone who wants to buy the Fontainebleau. But the stores are gone, and it's going to be very difficult to bring them back. Also because
retail's gone.
there's very little, they don't work anymore. It's not how retail works. And there's not that much documentation. I mean, there are drawings, but relatively little documentation on these stores. But these for me, were really the genius strokes, the complete blowing up of the box of the facade.
Exactly.
The dissolving of not the fourth wall, but the space between you and the object you desire, that shoe, that jewelry, that whatever it is that you really want.
Yeah.
That interpenetration between inside and outside, that complete floating of planes, that making of a space of completely uncertain scale where the only thing that you can hold on to, and the salesman's going to make sure you hold on to it, is the object you desire. That's your anchor. Everything else is sending you in a tizzy. That's what you're going to hold on to. That's what you're going to get out of this if you give them your hard-earned dollars. So that ability to dissolve all of reality with such incredible elegance in order to perform the simple act of selling a shoe or whatever the object is, that I think was really where Lapidus honed all of these skills that he later pulled off at a much larger scale in the hotels. But as is the case with many architects, it's not the very earliest work, but the work where you get it all together and you have a chance to really strut your stuff, show your style, show what you can do, because he was a supremely gifted architect. I was going back to his book, and if you look at his Beaux-Arts renderings, you can tell that this was a guy who really knew what he was doing. Yeah. Had incredible verve in that particular mode. And then when he gets bigger, there are more issues, and I would be surprised if he himself had not wanted that brocaded material on the sofa and sort of winced when he saw that. There were things that happened at that scale. This is, for me at least, the pure Lapidus. This is the Lapidus that really was able to shatter everything and leave a crystalline world of glass in his wake.
And a lot of architects saw these stores and copied them. He really, it is absolutely true to say, fair to say, he's not the only one, but he was absolutely one of the most important people for reinventing retail in America, in urban retail, not suburban, but reinventing urban retail with little tricks like the K Jewelers store, where he makes it appear as if the store is projecting out into the street with like a 4-inch deal, but in fact he actually drags the glass back 12, 16, 18 inches. So the ability to make it three-dimensional in a space this big that's real architecture at play. That's an architect who understands depth, who understands perspective, who understands materials. I don't think the glass is even important. It's the transparency that's important, right? And remember, retail stores at that time were boxes with a name on them. Yep. Even in big cities, it was a surprisingly small amount of transparency into the stores. And Lapidus just said, "Are you nuts? They want to sell your merchandise, right?" Yeah. And so they're all little stage sets. Every one of them is a little theatrical experience, but they're brilliant.
I think the boxes that project out, Lapidus would say, they could put their nose up to the glass. It was quite funny.
Yeah.
Because the kick out of the box is just enough for the shoes to fit under. So it's like every kitchen has a 4-inch kick so that we can get to the kitchen sink and not get wet. Well, he had like a 12-inch kick out so that people could really get their nose pressed into
the merchandise.
Right up to that jewelry.
Yeah.
And if you look at Frank Gehry's work, Frank Gehry in 1965 wound up doing a K Jewelers and a very similar window treatment, almost identical, at Cranbrook. When Mr. Lapidus was giving his lecture, I said, and you can mention to Gehry, who was there, he might remember that.
The really interesting comparison I would recommend to people if they're intrigued by this, there's a brand new book about a much more forgotten architect called Jacques Peters, who was another very supremely talented architect who died young, and so that's part of why he was forgotten. But he also revolutionized retail, first in Los Angeles and then on the East Coast. A little bit before, no, actually the stores were about the same period, so it's a very good comparison. Retail stores at that time were a place where you could experiment in the 1930s, exactly because they had to open themselves up. They had to do something, Great Depression, and there was new technology that allowed you to do this kind of lighting and this kind of glass and manipulate materials in this way. So it's also important to remember that Lapidus had the chance on at least 2 occasions in that retail revolution that was happening in American and European cities. There are some very famous stores at the same time in Europe in the period before the Second World War, and then in the eruption of resort hotels in the 1960s, late 1950s and 1960s, which were then booming in a similar way.
And his name again?
Jacques Peters.
Thank you for that. So we're going to go to the next one quickly. Ornament. We've said that Mr. Lapidus might have had ornamentia. Did we cover that enough, gentlemen?
I think we've covered ornament
Yeah.
pretty thoroughly.
I guess I want to show here is that Lapidus took it to extremes. He did dishes. He did bellhop suits. He did everything. He did the logos. So if you see the Eden Rocks or the font styles, he was doing everything. So this was
Which at the time was customary. Architects did the entire environment.
Yes. So I think the dishes also speak well to that idea. And then I thought it was a coincidence that Madonna did one of her songs, it's called Human Nature, and she shot the film at the Eden Rock. So I didn't know if that was a coincidence or not, but how does human nature change? Do you think it changes? Is it the same? Lapidus said, I designed for the people of my time. I studied human nature. He thought it was a moving target. What do you think?
I don't think human nature changes, but how people present themselves, how they act, how they appear changes.
Yeah, how they express themselves, but the basic human, I think that's part of why he was successful, is the basic human drives continue. They just morph with the style of the day, but we all want to be covered in the rain, we all want to sleep a certain amount of time, we all want to have human company. This is why COVID was so difficult for so many people. And I think that enabled someone like Morris to have a 60-year career. That's a long career for an architect, very, very long. And to be able to play successfully across decade after decade of work, it's because he actually understood those human fundamentals of human nature.
Well, she took this song to the hit factory. It was a hit for Madonna. So I think a lot of people resonate with it. It's just human nature.
Yeah.
We have swank. We have the Fontainebleau still retains its fundamental ebullience and a good deal of its George Raft swank.
This is exactly what we were talking about in the very beginning.
Yeah.
What did George Raft do? What was George Raft's profession?
Tell
He
me.
was a filmmaker.
Right.
Right? So this is the exact same thing that we started with. Lapidus is never far from theater, whether it's filmed theater or whether it's built theater, or whether he's acting in it. There's a great picture of him there dressed up in some Shakespearean, apparently, role in a young part, in the early part of his life. He's never far from it, but that's what theater studies human nature, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
it just has endless recapitulations of that, and he builds the environments where that can happen.
What do you say about swank or swagger or?
Yeah, I mean, there's the other way you can use the word style is in the sense that someone has style, by which you mean that they have a certain swagger,
Right.
that they have a certain ease with which they move, and they have that wonderful Italian word sprezzatura.
Sprezzatura.
And that, I would say that whatever the Jewish version of sprezzatura is, Morris Lapidus had it in spades.
I think the word is moxie.
Moxie, right.
He had a lot of moxie, that guy.
That's slightly different.
A little different.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to end with style is not permanent, Lapidus said. Beauty, that which Vitruvius called delight, is. That is Beauty and the Beach. And I would like to open it up to comments or any questions. Yes, go ahead.
Can you talk a little more about the relationship between Lapidus and Miami Beach? What drew him here? What was most of his work done here? How did it change Miami Beach, and how did Miami Beach change him?
I can say how he came. It was a very interesting story. In 1929, Morris Lapidus honeymooned in Miami Beach. When he and his wife disembarked from the taxi, all the Bacardi rum that she had stored in her girdle fell and busted on the pavement. Morris said, I stepped on Miami Beach in a wafting smell of bourbon and rum.
That's a great story.
And my wife is struggling to save the last bottle for our honeymoon night.
He had a lot of New York clients that were building here.
Yeah, that is true.
Tisches.
And I want to give a personal. I want to get back to B on this one because B is another one here. So they honeymooned here. Morris was working as a store designer, doing his most outrageous, great work, really thinking and instant architecture. It was all being done and going away. And B was saying, "You're not an architect. You're not the man I married at all. You're a store architect, and I married an architect, for Christ's sake," or for whatever sake. And she said, "I'm going to Florida. I'm going to rethink this whole thing." And she left.
Wow.
This is in 1943. B comes to where? Miami. And she's going to come down here and rethink this thing. So Lapidus is sending art cards that have, what do you call it? T-squares with hearts coming out of them and with tears falling down the board. And he's beside himself. He cannot stand it. And so his father knew the dilemma. And he said to his son, "I just got this thing in the mail from Admiral Rickover." And his father was doing metals and making brass lights, headlights for Carl Fisher's and Ford's cars. And he said, "Take a look at this. Do you think you can design this light?" Lapidus took a look at it and he said, "Sure can. What will you pay me?" He said, $10,000 a year. And Morris said, "I'll do it. I'll open my office." He came down to Miami, told B what the plan was, and he started Morris Lapidus Architects. Because of, and therefore saving his marriage with this contract. That would be the year that he took off from architecture, took off from doing work, and designed the signaling searchlight for his father and for Admiral Rickover, which we do have somewhere. We have the maquette of it here, but he took that minute to save his marriage, create a signaling searchlight for the world that saved the world in every ship-to-shore landing and is still in use today in World War II.
But
So
I think the problem is that on a personal level, that's all true, but I think you're asking questions that I would actually love to know the answer to, which would be to understand the particular movement of money and people, mainly from New York, but also from other places, to Miami at that particular time, which was already the second, maybe third wave of developers who had come to Miami Beach. And in fact went to a different part of Miami Beach and unlocked that, opened it up, pumped up the scale, obviously, brought a new clientele aligned to the airline industry as well. And I think that really would make a very interesting study on the interaction between money, real estate development, people, and style. Good book to be written.
yes, right. But there is a book, The Bubble in the Sun, which tries to talk about the developers and tries to put into perspective how it failed America with the Great Depression. All of the boom and bust in Miami and in Sarasota, in West Palm Beach, and in these areas down south, how it was affecting the economy. I know that I just wanted to mention that Lapidus was seeing his Jewish clients coming here. And
Yeah.
that was a big part of the draw coming down here. Charles, at the store that he was doing, the shoe store man said, hey buddy, I have this guy that's going down to Miami Beach to do something. Can you look at his plans and see if you can do anything to it? And so with the Sans Souci, he said he ripped out some parchment paper, drew on it what he thought it should look like, and just gave it to Novak and said, you know, it's yours, you know, like take it. And then they called him and said, we'd like you to really do it, not just give us a sketch. Would you really do this project? So the shoe store man actually got him the first job, and then it was after that it was success after success, but the same clientele.
There's a mic right there.
Although Mr. Lapidus was obviously one of a kind, who are his disciples today?
I think the one that's closest to him now, and someone who reveres him, is an architect from New York named David Rockwell, who has achieved the career that I think Morris would have actually liked to have had, in that he's equally busy designing the equivalent of shoe stores, in his case restaurants, but also hotels. And unlike Morris, he's also designed several Broadway plays, a number of television shows and movies.
The Academy Awards.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
The Academy Awards.
And the Academy Award Theater and the Academy Awards program themselves.
Did he know Mr. Lapidus?
Yes, he did. He met him as an older person. And David also was in theater and thought he was going to be a theater designer, not an architect. And he has spent a lot of his career having the exact same problems that Morris Lapidus did. People trying to get people to take him seriously, when in fact a lot of people see it as transitional and short, you know, temporal, very quick and gone. And it hurts him. It hurts David a great deal. He like Morris does not understand what is wrong with the temporal, what is wrong with the short term. Why should those not be designed with every bit as much care and devotion as the long term?
Yes.
And he doesn't see that battle between the timeless and the timely. He thinks they should both be good. But by far, those are the two most parallel.
I did furniture and mirror designs and things like that. And when we did the Las Vegas show, we had David Rockwell in the same house with us. I agree with that completely. David's one of the few people that blends all of the ideas of Lapidus into really wonderful spaces that should be given a second look.
Just a little aside, Morris Lapidus was probably destined to be an architect. The name Lapidus, it comes from Latin meaning stone, and the lapidarians were the builders of the amphitheaters and the Colosseums and things like that. So he didn't have any other choice.
Well, that's a rock I can lean on. Is there any other question from anyone? Yeah.
I just want to say this was really quite wonderful conversation and very interesting for my own presentation in 2-3 weeks. But does anybody know why Lapidus didn't actually work in the residential? As far as I know, there's only one house, right? Two. And can we talk a little bit about the differential there was between what was happening, let's say, in the sort of commercial aspect of Miami Beach and the really conservative side of the city in the residential area? Because that same dichotomy happens in the 20s, 30s as well. You had really these incredible hotels built by, Hauser and all of those things, and the houses were Georgian, So I'm wondering that differential, if you could talk about that in terms of perhaps the profession, but also maybe the culture of the city.
So on the housing side, it's the same thing when we were talking earlier about Americans searching for a style, a truly American way of doing things. These were not things that were discussed overly broadly. They were discussed in relatively small circles among the intelligentsia. Residential architecture was, in the US, was probably the clearest place where there was a search for what was appropriate and what could be American or something else. There were all kinds of, I can't get this thing to stand still, there were all kinds of pattern books that were published in the 20s and 30s that looked very heavily to Northern European precedents, rarely entertaining anything below Spain, maybe a little below Italy, or north, or west of England, or east of maybe Germany. It was a very, very Eurocentric notion of what housing could or should be. Of course, this was mostly an expatriate European population that was building houses at that time. Also, the home building business was not one done by architects. For the most part, it was done by independent small contractors. So they weren't educated as architects. Often architects drew up the drawings in these plan books and then left, and the elevations, and then the rest was left to the contractor to determine. My guess on Lapidus is why he, and thus you see this in Miami Beach, Los Angeles, all the cities that were growing at that time. Now it's very charming. A lot of people thought it was very false at the time because there's really nothing in the US that would suggest that you would build a plaster timber home that ended 500, 700 years earlier. Lapidus probably didn't do more houses because there's an economy of scale in architectural practices. Houses are intensely demanding of time. And if you have a big office, and he had 2 big offices, lots of people.
70 people.
In each.
Yeah, 30 down here and 40 in New York.
And this was a lot of people doing huge hotels. Just on this wall alone, you have 1955, 56, 57, hundreds of hotel rooms, each separate projects. There's no way they could have lavished the attention on a private home.
He used to joke that the only way he did the Finn residence was because he was the dentist drilling his tooth until he promised he would.
Yeah.
And so he was under the drill, and he said, I had to do it. But he said, I did not like it. And then the other one was on Michigan, there's a donut house, and he did that because the man just would not go through with a payment if he just didn't promise to draw something. So the 2 houses here in Miami Beach, I have been in both of them and seen both of them. Lapidus did 10 variations on the Iber resident with the Finn house, and those studies are brilliant and they're fabulous. He only did 1 study for the donut house. So I think he felt he resolved that one quickly, but it wasn't his cup of tea. He did a house for his brother. He did rumpus rooms for for the Seagram family because they wanted to have that. He did some private things like that for some of the very large clients, but certainly under the drill he did a house, and that I think that explains the pain of doing it. But I do want to mention that Lapidus did incredible living units and residential, and Millionaires Row is something that we have here in Miami Beach, and we also have the Morris Lapidus MIMO district, and we're not talking about that in this particular minute, but I think Lapidus did 192 housing units. He did Trump's Villages. So, I mean, there are so many housing projects that are not being talked about because we're excluding them about the hotels. But he did extravagant and wonderful planning, even winning awards for the layouts he did for his housing. And particularly, he did very sensitive public housing because he was a child of the ghetto. He was very sensitive when he did these public housings. He was very proud of some of these that won awards for the people.
Well, I have a question actually about his apartment in Belle Isle. We have his dining table here in the exhibit. Were you ever able to go there, and what was his sort of thinking behind that? Because if you want to think of like a residential, it seemed like it was designed by him from top to bottom.
It was exactly the same as he did it in 1963 until he died. There was very little change except putting in the ornaments that he collected along his travels, but he had built shelves for them, and he had put shelves in the staircase for his Murano glass collection that he collected. And he had cases for his dishes where he had over 10 sets of 10 seatings for dishes and all different types of silverware. Once we did a DIFA party for Carlos Cisneros, and we set 10 tables with 10 people place settings with 10 different, incredibly different table settings, down to the caviar spoon, to the sniffer, to the water glass, every single 10 sets of them. So I have to tell you, he had quite the cabinetry that would do all of this. I remember Todd Eberly came to photograph for Nest magazine, and he walked around and he said, "I can tell I don't live well enough." so when a photographer who's been, I've been everywhere, man, I mean, when he says, "I can see I haven't lived well," it was quite funny.
There was a beautiful painting about theater. There was a beautiful painting about theater in his apartment, if I'm not mistaken.
A beautiful
Painting about theater.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. A very beautiful painting. You're right. Well, it was Bernstein playing on the piano. And so this is about a 6 foot by 5 foot. Lapidus had a downstairs area where he painted, and he enjoyed painting quite a bit. And for the Bernstein, he had a lot of different studies for the people. But I think some of his more interesting studies were done in New York when he was doing like the cardinal on the balcony, and it almost looks like Boogie Woogie, where he has just the lights of buildings in the distance in a grid. It's very interesting work. Or where he did the cranes on a building, or the Brooklyn Bridge, or even he did Coney Island, because he thought that Coney Island was this seminal image embedded in his mind that informed all of his work, this swirling great. So he printed these things like this. So I think some of his paintings have yet to really be discussed in terms of how he parsed out his creativity. But any other comment? Any other question? No, thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us, and I wanted to let everyone know that the next and final lecture is on November 18th with Jean-Francois, and also Ira Giller and Alan Schulman. So thank you so much to our speakers who have traveled here from far, beautiful places, and we hope to see you again soon in Miami Beach. And thank you to our guests, and we'll see you all soon. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.